So we're here with Nariman Massoumi from Bristol, and you have a film in the festival this year, and it was the opening film, which we were very honored and glad that your film was chosen as the opening film. Could you a little bit talk about your film, because maybe the people who are watching this maybe will not have a chance to see your film, or maybe will see it after they watch this interview.
Yeah, sure. And I was I have to say, very honoured that the festival screened my film in the opening ceremony, and I'm very thankful that it was even selected. It's such a wonderful festival. The film is about the poet Dylan Thomas, and who's very well known as the author of a number of really famous poems in the English language, such as "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night" and a play known as "Under Milk Wood." And it's about his journey through Iran in the 1951 on an assignment to write a script for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which later became known as BP. And so the film follows his journey through Iran and his encounter with the people and the country, and his reflections on, I suppose, the kind of oil and modernity in that period and the kind of dark underbelly of all of it. It's his first encounter with colonialism, and only encounter with colonialism. And the film uses his own words that he wrote in his letters and in a radio broadcast for the BBC, and combines that with some mainly archive photographs from the BP archive itself, that also tell their own story of the colonial encounter. And the voiceover is done by the Welsh actor Michael Sheen. Mm-hmm.
But in the film you also have kind of an Iranian perspective as well, right? Because there's some other text.
Oh yes,
so
of course.
Can you talk about that?
So the majority of the voiceover is Dylan Thomas's, but at some point in the film where there's a section on the oil workers, then I bring in the voice of an oil worker, which I took from a letter or two letters in Iranian newspapers around the same period, or a bit earlier, and to sort of disrupt the dominance of Dylan Thomas's voice, and to bring about a kind of a perspective on oil films from the people who were in those films.
Mm-hmm. And kind of going back to the original idea, how and why you decided to make this film, like how you came across to this Dylan Thomas writing, and then what inspired you to turn that into a film?
Yeah, so when I'd heard from a friend that Dylan Thomas had been in Iran, I was really intrigued, because I would never have thought that Dylan Thomas had been to Iran. I hadn't heard about it. So I was interested in know why he was there, and I was even more surprised that he was there to write what was essentially it was a publicity film, but a propaganda film for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And then I dug a bit more and realised that, Dylan Thomas was not just a poet, but he'd written a lot of documentary films and fiction scripts. And then I discovered that he'd also written about them in his own letters, and that he'd written this radio broadcast. So, and the thing that struck me was his writing about Iran. It was not like other writing on Iran. There were often a lot of travel logs from British travellers, and they tend to have a very Orientalist and romantic perspective on Iran in that period. Whereas Dylan Thomas had elements of an Orientalist perspective, but he was not interested in the kind of romanticism. He was interested in the dirt and the disease and the kind of contradictions of oil and its colonial presence in Iran, and what that meant. And I felt like he had some kind of metaphoric imagery in his writing, and I felt that this needed to be made into a film.
And then going back to this digging, you obviously dug out a lot of archival material. Could you talk about that process and how you kind of decided? I mean, was it the archival material that you discovered that kind of made you decide to use it in this way, or was it that you were looking for this kind of archival material?
So as I read the writing, I knew I had the issue of I wanted the writing to be heard. So I didn't want to adapt it because I wanted the poetic elements of it to exist. So there was a question of what images I was going to use. And as an exercise, I tried to play with some images that I found on the internet to sort of try and visualize the film. And as soon as I did that, I realized that photographs and still images were a really good way of absorbing the kind of richness and layeredness of his writing, and for us to be able to really listen to them. And that's when I sort of decided that, you know, this film was going to be made from photographs in the main. At the same time, I was going to the BP archive to just try and find out more about the film that he was attached to, and there was a big element of documentation about the film, surprisingly. But there was very little about Dylan Thomas. And what I did discover while I was there, that there was a huge photographic archive that had its own elements that I think were not existing in Dylan Thomas's perspective. So that's where I thought this could be a really interesting combination.
Mm-hmm. And what about getting access and acquiring this material?
Access was quite relatively easy at first. I explained from the beginning that what project I was working on, and I said I wanted to use the images, and I knew that as long as I filled out particular forms, and that I could use it for the purposes of the film. So I had no difficulties in access. But, you know, the challenge for me, I think, was more creative. Research-wise, it took a lot of time going through the archives and looking through the images and scanning them and going back and looking at them and trying to figure out how this was going to work. A lot of time in working out how the letters, because, you know, they were long letters, not necessarily all about Iran, they were all about his wife, to his wife, where he was actually, they were kind of love letters. And so finding the extracts and combining them and trying to work out a kind of narrative that I could put together. And then there was the challenge of sound, you know, because it has a really layered sound design that took a long time to put together.
There was a question I wanted to ask. Let me see if I could remember that. Yes. So, in addition to the still images that you found in the archives, you also found some films, and there, you know, not many, but very few moving images in your film. Of course, the film itself is a moving image, but
Yes.
I mean, in terms of the archival material, could you also talk about your choice of including those moving images?
Yeah, so there's a colour footage in the middle of the film, and the reason I conceived of this is that the still images for me, with sound, play around with photographic time and cinematic time. So, to some extent, the film feels proto-cinematic in the sense that it's almost like an illustrated lecture. And I knew I also was using problematic images. So while...
Problematic in what sense?
It's because these images were made by BP. They have relations of power with the subjects that are in them. So they have a role in some senses. They have a kind of, the people who are in them are necessarily, we're not choosing to be in them. So while I wanted to use a kind of historical immersion, so using sound so that we were almost in that space, I wanted to make sure that we had some kind of distancing elements that we came out of those and we were broken from the kind of suspension of disbelief of being in the film. And the moving image for me was a way of allowing the film to play around with our sense of what these images were and remind us that they were images. They also, I think, did something else, which is I imagined this was a film that was in Dylan Thomas's imagination that he would not been able to have made because of the constraints of his assignment. So if he really wanted to make a film, he made something like this. So I feel like the colour is almost like a film, well, in my head, and you can tell me if you disagree, in my head, the colour is almost like a film emerging in his imagination. And it was the moment in which he encounters young children, and I think there's a human connection there that was pivotal for him and his experience. So there were sort of multiple reasons why I tried to use the colour footage. Yeah.
That's very interesting that, you know, you kind of imagined the film that Dylan Thomas might have imagined in a way. And also the same with, sorry, I'm interrupting, but also same with the kind of taking extracts from different letters and turning them into, in a way, one grand letter.
Yes, exactly.
You know.
That's a very good observation because these letters would have broken in time, you know, in days. And instead I chose to start it in Abadan and to make it all one letter, as though he's sitting there writing these letters, one letter, and reflecting on his journey. And I think the idea of doing that was to keep a kind of present tense in the whole film, that we're there with him, and to be in his psychological space. But yes, in terms of the film, because I didn't want to do an adaptation, I didn't want to make it a film that he would have made. I wanted to retain the fact that these were almost his writing and his reflection and his poetry, as though he's going through these thoughts, but that they could almost be considered by the audience as a film that might have been made. So it's that in-between space, really. Yeah.
I like that in-between space emphasis because it's also fragmentary in a sense, but at the same time it's at the same time it's a whole. But you know, you have both in the film. I felt like. You know, so it's kind of a kind of complete text, but it's also at the same time a kind of a fragmented text at the same time.
Yeah. No, I think that's again another good observation because I'm glad that it had that effect because, you know, the problem I also had is that Dylan Thomas was in this period of political upheaval. You know, it's really a pivotal moment in Iran. It was the nationalization of oil, and in the run-up to that there were protests and strikes. But he didn't write about that. So I had that creative problem and imagined I have evidence of his encounter and I have an idea of what he might have encountered, or maybe he didn't encounter them. So there were elements in the film where, for example, he's writing about women wearing the veil, and at those points I felt a need to, using the archive, to suggest that there was more to that story, that there were protests taking place, and maybe Dylan Thomas encountered them and didn't write about them, or maybe he didn't see it or notice, or maybe he didn't feel interested in that. So I left that open to the audience to sort of have that encounter themselves and imagine that there was more going on than what the words were saying. Yeah. So that, I think it speaks to the fragmentation of the archive I was working with and trying to keep that. But that's partly why I used black as well, to kind of say that there are gaps within what I was trying to show.
I think that's very important to kind of remind the viewer about the fragmented nature of what we do in a way.
Yeah. I mean, it's always the problem with archive. Reconstituting the past from the archive is always going to be problematic and full of gaps. And you have to figure out, you know, how you're going to do that. Whether it's film or whether it's archival research, it's always the same thing, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think bitti değil mi? Süremiz nasıl?
Bitiriş olarak bir şey yapalım. otobüs. Thank you. Bye bye.
Tamam, okay. Maybe as some kind of a closure to our conversation.
Yeah.
Do you want to say, maybe kind of reflect on, I mean, besides, you know, your having your film in the festival, but any reflections on the festival itself? Because, you know, it's kind of a unique festival in Turkey, and it's the 11th year, and you're here for the first time, right, on this island and at this festival. So maybe your personal reflections on, you know, being at the festival this year as a filmmaker, as someone with an Iranian background who's coming from Bristol, and you know, being here in Turkey. And you said yesterday that you're closest ever to Iran in terms of a screening venue.
Yeah, geographically, I'm as close as I have been with this film to Iran. I'll be honest, at first, I really was happy that I was selected, but when I saw how the journey to get here, I thought, this is going to be difficult, because it's in the middle of term for me. I'm teaching at university. It's a very difficult period. I have children. But I eventually decided, I have to make it happen. And I'm so glad I did, because it's been really, really special. It was special to be in the opening ceremony, but it's a beautiful island. I think I found the people very warm here. I found the festival really well organised. I feel like I've been treated like royalty. So in every sense, it's been a really positive experience. But I've seen some really interesting films already, really thought-provoking films. So I'm very glad to be here, but there's also a cultural context for me. I've, came from Iran to the UK at the age of 5. So I'm very much brought up in Britain. But when I come to a place like Turkey, it seems to almost sit at that in-between space, more in-between space, between Iran and my British experience. There's this kind of mix of European and Middle Eastern culture that is almost ideal for me. And when I first came here, the first thing I got was corn on cob in the streets of Istanbul. When I came to the island, having breakfast with kind of an omelette and cheese, it's I feel at home.
Maybe you'll come back again.
Definitely.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Size de çok teşekkür ederim.